The Ghost of the Lighthouse. Hello friends, welcome to the Horror Ghost Stories. The story begins. The night was dark and stormy, a relentless howl of wind against the rocky coast of a secluded island. The lighthouse stood tall, its beam cutting through the thick mist that rolled in from the ocean, casting eerie shadows on the jagged cliffs below. The keeper of the lighthouse, a man named Samuel, had lived there alone for years, maintaining the beacon that guided ships safely through the treacherous waters. He had grown accustomed to the isolation, the quiet, and the endless sound of crashing waves against the shore. But that night was different. There was something in the air, an oppressive stillness that hung over the island like a heavy cloak. The storm outside raged, but the lighthouse itself seemed to pulse with an energy that Samuel couldn't shake off. It began when he heard a soft knock on the door. At first, he thought it was the wind playing tricks, but the knock came again, louder this time, followed by a faint voice calling out his name. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't seen another soul for weeks. Who could be out there, especially in such a brutal storm? Reluctantly, he opened the door, but no one was standing there. Only the howling wind and the thick, swirling mist greeted him. He stepped outside cautiously, scanning the shore, but saw nothing. The eerie silence was unsettling, as if the world itself had stopped moving. He closed the door and locked it, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled deep within him. As the night wore on, strange things began to happen. The lighthouse seemed to groan and creak, its timbers bending under the weight of some unseen force. Samuel heard footsteps above him, in the tower where the light was housed. But when he climbed the narrow stairs to investigate, no one was there. The beam of the lighthouse flashed across the turbulent sea, illuminating the blackness for a brief moment, but when it returned to the shore, Samuel thought he saw something move in the distance. A figure, tall and thin, standing on the rocks by the water's edge, watching him. He blinked, and the figure was gone. His pulse quickened, and he hurried back to the main room, locking the door once more. He tried to tell himself it was nothing, just his imagination playing tricks in the isolation of the lighthouse, but the unease gnawed at him. The strange occurrences continued. The door would rattle, as if someone were trying to get in. Objects would shift slightly, out of place, as though moved by invisible hands. His nights were filled with an ever-growing sense of dread, and the days brought no relief, as the storm showed no signs of stopping. Then came the voices. It started with whispers, faint and distant, just on the edge of hearing. At first, Samuel thought it was the wind, but they grew clearer. Voices calling to him, urging him to come outside, to join them. They were so real, so close, that he could almost feel the breath of the speakers on his skin. Desperately, he tried to ignore them, retreating deeper into the lighthouse, but the voices only grew louder. They were everywhere, all around him, circling like vultures. Samuel was no longer sure where reality ended and his mind began. He felt like he was losing himself, like something inside of him was slowly breaking apart. Then, one night, the voices stopped. A deafening silence filled the air, heavier than the storm outside. It was as if the very essence of the island had gone still, frozen in time. Samuel wandered through the lighthouse, drawn to the top of the tower, unable to shake the feeling that something was waiting for him. As he ascended the stairs, he saw a shadow standing in the beam of the lighthouse light. A figure, tall and gaunt, its face obscured by the hood of a tattered cloak. It turned toward him, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Samuel tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. The figure raised its hand, and a cold, unnatural wind swept through the room. The light flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows across the walls. The figure spoke then, its voice a rasping whisper that seemed to echo inside Samuel's head. "You should never have come here," it said, its words seeping into his very soul. "The island is ours now. You are ours." In that moment, Samuel understood. The lighthouse wasn't just a beacon for ships, it was a prison, a trap for souls lost to the sea. The island itself was alive, and it fed on the souls of those who were drawn to it. Samuel had been its prisoner for years, unknowingly trapped in the cycle of torment and despair. The storm outside wasn't natural. It was part of the island's curse, a storm that would never end until it claimed another soul. And now, Samuel's time had come. He stumbled back, his legs weak with fear, but the figure advanced toward him, its hands reaching out. The wind howled, the storm outside raging with renewed fury, but Samuel knew it was useless. There was nowhere to run. The lighthouse was no longer a sanctuary, it was a tomb. And as the figure closed in on him, the light of the lighthouse flickered one final time, before plunging the island into darkness. The storm subsided in the morning, and the lighthouse stood silent, its beam still as strong as ever. But Samuel was gone, vanished without a trace. Those who came to the island after him spoke of a strange unease that filled the air. They felt watched, as if the island itself was alive, and the lighthouse towered over them like an unblinking eye. Some would hear whispers on the wind, others would catch glimpses of a shadow moving across the rocks. But no one ever saw Samuel again. The island had claimed him, as it had claimed so many before him. And as long as the lighthouse stood, the curse would remain, waiting for the next soul to stumble upon its shores. Days turned into weeks, but the lighthouse stood untouched, unmoving in the face of time. The wind continued to howl, and the fog rolled in with each new night, thick and unyielding. The island seemed to be a place outside the reach of time and reason, a place where the ordinary laws of nature no longer applied. Those who ventured close to the shore would speak of strange dreams that filled their nights, dreams of endless darkness, of twisted figures calling out from the mist, of a lighthouse that glowed with an unnatural light, beckoning them toward it. None of them ever dared to come too close, for something deep within their souls told them that it was a place of death. But one fateful night, a group of travelers, 3 men and 2 women, decided to test the island's eerie reputation. They had heard the stories, the whispers of those who had vanished into the fog, but they were determined to uncover the truth. Armed with flashlights and the bravado of the young, they boarded a small boat and set sail toward the cursed island. The storm that had never truly passed seemed to welcome them, its winds pushing them closer to the shore, and as the boat rocked precariously over the waves, they couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. The lighthouse loomed in the distance, its beam cutting through the darkness like a blade. As they approached, one of the women, Emily, felt a tightness in her chest, as though something unseen was pressing down on her. She tried to shake it off, but the sensation only grew stronger. The closer they came, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air itself seemed thick, as though it carried the weight of centuries of torment. The others felt it too, but they brushed off their unease as a result of the storm and the isolation. They docked the boat, their hearts racing with a mix of fear and excitement. They stepped onto the island, their feet sinking slightly into the damp earth, and immediately, they felt the pull of something ancient, something that had been waiting for them. They made their way toward the lighthouse, the beam of light flashing over them like a watchful eye. The wind picked up, howling through the trees and across the rocky terrain, but the group pressed on, driven by curiosity. The door to the lighthouse was ajar, as if it had been waiting for them to arrive. Inside, the air was cold, far colder than it should have been given the raging storm outside. The walls of the lighthouse seemed to close in on them, narrowing with every step they took. Their footsteps echoed in the silence, disturbing only by the distant sound of the waves crashing against the rocks. As they made their way up the spiral staircase toward the top of the tower, the temperature dropped even further, until they could see their breath fogging in the air. Emily was the first to reach the top. As she stepped onto the platform where the light had once rotated, she gasped in shock. There, standing in the center of the room, was a figure tall and thin, cloaked in tattered robes. Its face was obscured, but Emily could feel its eyes on her, burning into her very soul. A cold wind swept through the room, and the figure turned toward her, its movements jerky, unnatural. "Leave now," it rasped, its voice like the sound of dry leaves scraping across stone. "You should not have come." The group froze, fear freezing them in place. But one of the men, David, stepped forward, his bravado waning but still present. "What are you? What happened to the last keeper?" The figure raised its hand slowly, its bony fingers pointing toward the door. "He is gone," it whispered. "And so shall you be." Suddenly, the lighthouse began to tremble. The beam of light flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. A low, guttural sound filled the room, like the earth itself groaning in pain. The group huddled together, the air thickening around them. The stairs behind them seemed to disappear into nothingness, as if the tower itself was becoming endless, trapping them inside. The figure stepped closer, its long, skeletal hands reaching out to them. Emily screamed, but no sound came from her mouth, only a crushing pressure on her chest, as though something were trying to pull her apart from the inside. The others tried to flee, but they were paralyzed, unable to move or even speak. The wind outside howled louder, and then came the voices, faint at first, but growing steadily louder, until they filled every inch of the lighthouse, whispering their names, their deepest fears, their regrets. "You should never have come here," the voice of the figure echoed. "You are now part of us. You are now ours." The walls of the lighthouse seemed to close in around them, and the group began to feel the cold hands of the dead reach out from the darkness, gripping them, pulling them toward the edges of the void. Desperate, they fought to break free, but the darkness was too powerful. It swallowed them whole, consuming their souls in a terrifying silence. And then, just as quickly as it had all begun, the island fell quiet once more. The storm outside stilled, and the lighthouse stood undisturbed, its beam flashing across the sea. But the air was thick with the sense of something lost, something taken. The souls of those who had dared to uncover the truth had been claimed, their cries absorbed by the island itself. The lighthouse, a silent sentinel, continued its endless watch over the rocks and waters below, waiting for the next unwitting travelers to come too close. As the years passed, the stories of the lighthouse persisted. No one ever dared to set foot on the island again. But sometimes, on stormy nights, when the wind howls through the trees and the fog rolls thick over the coast, sailors would swear they saw a light in the distance, flickering faintly. They would hear whispers on the wind, carried from the island, but no one ever saw the figures who stood on the rocks, watching, waiting. The curse of the lighthouse lived on, as strong as ever, and those who were drawn to its light never returned. Years passed, and the island became a place of legend, a forbidden territory whispered about in hushed tones by those who dared to speak of it at all. The stories of the lighthouse and its cursed power spread, growing more twisted with each retelling. To some, it was an abandoned ruin, a dark relic of the past. To others, it was a living thing, a monstrous force that devoured anyone foolish enough to venture too close. But as the world moved on, the island remained unchanged, its ominous presence lingering in the shadows of time. Then, one fateful day, a lone man named Edward came to the island. He was a man of science, an investigator, determined to uncover the truth behind the legends. He had heard the stories of vanished keepers, of ghostly apparitions, of sailors who had been drawn into the clutches of the lighthouse, but he was not one to believe in superstition. He had dedicated his life to unraveling the mysteries of the world through logic and reason, and the thought of a supernatural curse seemed laughable to him. Equipped with nothing more than a flashlight, a notebook, and an unshakable resolve, Edward made his way to the island. He had researched everything he could find about it, its history, the lighthouse's purpose, and the strange disappearances that had occurred over the years. He came to the conclusion that the lighthouse was simply an old structure, a victim of the elements and time. The disappearances, he believed, were the result of bad luck, a series of unfortunate accidents. As his boat crept closer to the shore, Edward felt a chill in the air, the temperature dropping several degrees. He thought nothing of it, just the natural effect of the sea breeze, but a part of him couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The storm clouds that had been gathering on the horizon seemed to be moving faster than they should have, almost as if the island itself was beckoning him, urging him to come closer. When his boat landed on the rocky shore, the wind picked up, pushing him toward the lighthouse. The fog was thick, swirling around his feet like a blanket of cold mist. He set out toward the structure, his heart pounding not with fear, but with anticipation. He wanted answers. He wanted to prove that the stories were nothing more than fiction. The lighthouse towered ahead, its jagged silhouette cutting through the fog like a dark sentinel watching over him. He reached the door, which creaked open as he pushed it. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of old wood, but there was something else, something cold and unnatural. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he stepped further into the lighthouse, the sound of his footsteps echoing off the stone walls. The place felt alive, as though it were watching him, waiting. Edward ascended the stairs, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. He reached the top, where the lighthouse's powerful light once shone across the ocean, but the room was empty. The machinery was silent, coated in layers of dust. The air grew colder still, and for the first time, a flicker of unease stirred within him. He turned to leave, but that's when he heard it, a low, guttural sound, like the rattle of chains. The noise seemed to come from below, from the depths of the lighthouse, and then the whispers began. They were faint at first, almost imperceptible, like the soft rustle of leaves. But as Edward descended the stairs, they grew louder, until they filled the entire space. The voices were not human. They were otherworldly, raspy, and distorted, as though speaking from the depths of the earth itself. And then, through the fog of his growing terror, Edward heard one word that cut through the darkness, a word that made his blood run cold. Leave. His flashlight flickered, and the shadows in the room seemed to lengthen, stretching toward him with unnatural speed. His heart raced as the temperature in the lighthouse plummeted. Every instinct told him to flee, to escape before it was too late, but his feet felt frozen in place, as if the very ground beneath him had turned to ice. The whispers became louder, more insistent, as if they were surrounding him, pressing in on him from all sides. He turned to run, but something was wrong. The stairs that had once led him back down were no longer there. In their place was an endless black void, stretching down into a darkness so deep that he could not see the bottom. Panicking, Edward backed away, but the walls seemed to shift, narrowing around him. The air was thick, suffocating, and then, Out of the corner of his eye, he saw it, a figure, tall and thin, standing just beyond the edge of the light. Its face was hidden, but its presence was undeniable. It was there, watching him, waiting. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, empty and hollow, as though they were seeing through him, into him. "Welcome," the figure whispered, its voice like the scraping of 1,000 bones against stone. "You have come to join us." Edward tried to speak, but his voice failed him. His throat was tight, constricted by fear, and his mind raced to understand what was happening. This wasn't just an old lighthouse. It was something else. Something cursed. Something alive. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. It reached out with long, bony fingers, and Edward felt an icy grip wrap around his wrist, pulling him toward it. The darkness swelled around him, filling his vision, drowning out everything else. His mind screamed, but there was no escape. No way out. Then, in a moment of unbearable cold, Edward was consumed. His body went limp, his consciousness fading, until the last thing he heard was the sound of the whispers, filling his mind completely. "You are one of us now." The next morning, the storm had passed, and the sun broke through the clouds, casting its light across the now silent island. A search party arrived, responding to a distress signal that Edward had sent before he vanished. They combed the island, searching for any sign of him, but the lighthouse was empty. No traces of his presence remained. His boat sat anchored just off the shore, untouched. The only thing they found was a single note, lying on the steps of the lighthouse. It was written in a hurried hand, the ink smeared as if the writer had been shaking. It read simply, "I was wrong. It's real. Don't come." But it was too late. The lighthouse would never be left alone. It would continue to lure, to draw those who were curious or reckless enough to uncover its secrets. And with every new soul that came, the island would grow stronger, its hunger never satisfied, its darkness never fading. The ghost of the lighthouse would wait, eternally, for the next soul to cross its threshold. The end.